everyone. Welcome back to Lights, Camera, Accolade, to our bonus episode for February, which, as we all know, is Black History Month, or I should say, as we all used to know, but now Google doesn't. I know, we're already coming out swinging. I'm Sarah.
I'm Jake. Jake is here.
I'm Abby. I'm also here.
So for February, I want to focus on some early Black filmmakers and some of the context around which they made film. As well as you can imagine, it was a very difficult time period. And it's not something that we really learn about either on the creative side or the historical side. I honestly, even just in researching this, learned a lot. And I would recommend to listeners, to anyone who is really interested in this topic, there are scholars, there are podcasts, there are content creators that fully focus on this subject matter where you could really do more of a deep dive and understand. I know there's Black on Black Cinema, which reviews specifically movies through that context. And I think, Abby, you had one that you'd mentioned that was really funny to listen to, but I can't remember the name right now.
Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. That podcast is terrific.
So good. They, don't go through things chronologically, but you get such great insight. And obviously they have just great personalities that are fun to listen to.
Check that out.
Yeah, highly recommend that podcast. It's incredible.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the filmmaking context of this time. And then Jake, I don't know if you want to give some of the historical context surrounding that, but just you can kind of guess at this time that Black filmmakers faced way more challenges stemming from systemic racism, limited resources, various societal barriers than white filmmakers did. So much so that I think if you're going through film studies, if you're watching these movies, so much of it is very clearly like white stories told by white people, and that becomes the default for film. But that wasn't due to a lack of desire or even a lack of attempts from filmmakers from other groups, and we'll get into some more of that in other bonus episodes, like for women filmmakers or Asian filmmakers, etc. But definitely here in America, Black filmmakers, unfortunately, they struggled to get financing for their projects, right? So just from a funding and resource standpoint, banks, investors, they were reluctant to give money to Black creators. And so there are very few avenues for financial support. So just right off the base, that's limiting their ability to even produce film. And from what we've seen with mainstream cinema at this time and throughout much of the following decades, there was a perpetuation of harmful racial stereotypes, which we've touched on the podcast already because we've started seeing those types of characters. But when putting that into the context of like what that means for Black filmmakers, like whether you're a director or an actor, you kind of had a choice. Either you try to conform to these sorts of things so that you can at least be successful in mainstream media, or you have to go off on your own to try and do something independently, which won't reach as many people, will have difficulties funding. And much of that effort, even, I feel like, is trying to combat the racial stereotypes. So you're still pigeonholed in a lot of ways into the types of stories that you can tell, which really sucks, because the more you learn about that and the more you learn about how that was so limited, it really truly makes you reflect so much on what types of stories were either lost or never got to be told during all of this. That kind of just leads directly into censorship and the Hays Code, which we've talked about a lot, which made all of this worse. Yeah. So you couldn't have interracial romance. You had to have Black characters that continued to reinforce stereotypes and just limited opportunity, and specifically censored like any social or political commentary that would upset the power structures at the time. So you couldn't really talk about racism, segregation, or things like lynching or systemic racism that people were facing that kind of was swept under the rug in terms of from a movie sense right at that time. So that was just some of the context that I wanted to give, and I'm really excited to be able to deep dive. And we can talk a little bit more about Oscar Micheaux here, but Jake, I wanted to give you a chance to add to that if you had other things.
Sure. Well, Sarah, what a great introduction, because when you had this idea, thank you indeed. And when you had this idea to focus in on this topic, you mentioned the movie we were going to watch, and I got to tell you, it spurred an interest in this whole arena of filmmaking, which I'm a bit ashamed to admit I had very little knowledge of. So thank you for that. Right off the bat, just saying, I'm a white person. There's no way for me to fully understand the Black experience in America today or in the past, but I can do my best based on the information we have and our own experiences to kind of interpret that experience and contextualize it within wider America. But anyway, I just wanted to mention too, off of what you were saying, Sarah, a lot of what you were saying about the struggle of Black folks integrating themselves into American filmmaking and culture, and you could even say literature. In this case, what I bring up here is there was a great movie that came out the last year or the year before called American Fiction, starring Jeremy Wright, and it deals a lot about how some of those challenges you mentioned, which were so significant back in the time we're about to talk about, even still persist today.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Just really recommend folks take a look at that movie if they haven't had a chance. Really enjoyed that one. But that movie is part of what made me feel like I have to do my disclaimer too, that I am a white person. But yeah, I think it'll be useful to talk a little bit about the historical context here too. As we've mentioned on previous podcasts, like the All Quiet podcast and even some of our earlier episodes, the immediate post-World War II period was very much one of a lot of social change. Obviously, during the war, there was this big feeling of the old order being destabilized, particularly in Europe, but also to some extent in the United States. The masses were asked to mobilize for the war effort. And as a result of that, ideas around the social contract started to change. So people started making more demands during and immediately after the war. Things like women getting the right to vote, workers starting to organize more actively in their workplace, and Black Americans starting to move around the country and pursue new opportunities that previously weren't as much open to them. So think about the wider context here. Think about the revolution that took place in Russia in 1917 that overthrew the Tsar. Think about the Spartacist uprising that we mentioned on our All Quiet episode. That was that aborted attempt by socialists and other elements in Germany to overthrow that government there and establish one more responsive to working class needs. And then think about even in the United States, this is a time period where anarchist bombings and assassinations and assassination attempts, even of presidents, is very prevalent. This is a time where, as I mentioned a second ago, labor is really kicking off. And of course, more people in society are becoming more prominent and finding their place. So naturally and unfortunately, that engineers a backlash in certain ways. And in particular, American elites and white American Protestants, which were still very demographically dominant and politically, socially, economically dominant at that point, they responded in a number of ways. One way was with the first Red Scare, which took place during this time period, which was a real clamping down on some of that labor activity, but also, and more importantly for our discussion today, was the rise of what's often viewed as the second generation of the Ku Klux Klan. Whereas the first Ku Klux Klan was more relegated to the American South and was in direct response to Reconstruction and was kind of localized terrorism aimed at Black Americans in those areas. Unfortunately, the second Ku Klux Klan's rise during this time period was much more of a national movement. And a lot of folks know, it's to some extent, it gave rise immediately after and in response to probably the first blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, a movie that was so popular it was screened in the White House by the president, who reportedly said some nice things about it. So the Ku Klux Klan, they were afraid of and angry about a lot of things. But one of the things they were really afraid of, as displayed in that terrible but important film, was this notion of non-white sexual violence towards white women and just Black Americans taking a more prominent role in society in general. They were also anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, anti-alcohol, very pro-prohibition. And they became a major political force immediately after World War I, and especially during the 1920s. So this is an important context to keep in mind because the movie we're going to talk about today was released in 1920, right between two major racial riots that took place in this time. The Red Summer of 1919, That was a racial riot that killed 38 mostly African-American people in Chicago, amongst many other riots. And then, of course, most folks will remember the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. Shortly after the release of our movie we're going to talk about today, where local white citizens and local officials in the Tulsa, Oklahoma area destroyed, and when I say destroy, I mean completely destroyed, a segment of Tulsa which had become known as Black Wall Street, an area where African Americans really sort of have developed their own parallel economy to the white one that they were excluded from, and were really flourishing economically and finding their footing in this climate of major change that really pissed off, shall we say, the white Protestant population surrounding the area, and they unleashed that force. So it's,
and of course, never taught in school, or at least not in Texas where I grew up. Like absolutely not mentioned.
Absolutely. You wonder how different our culture and our politics would be if more folks were introduced to these unfortunate realities of our history earlier on. But you kind of have to do your own digging as you get older, and it seems like that's just getting worse. But yeah, like I said before, when you talked about this movie, it made me look into the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, which was a all-black studio designed specifically to help counteract, these stereotypes that were being displayed in Hollywood at this time under the studio system. I think about that character of Isaiah from Cimarron, which was such a disturbing minstrel character, but I think we'll unfortunately see more of that. Well, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, although short-lived, it existed from 1916 to 1923. They really actively sought to counteract that, and they promoted what later came to be called race films, which were essentially films designed for Black audiences, talking about Black topics, Black experience, because these were areas of life that the studio system just seemed to have no interest in displaying or catering to. So it was, an economist would say it was a market share being missed out on, and there were terrible ramifications to that. And so these creative Black Americans thought best to get started. So our film, releases in the context of all of that.
I was hoping that we would be able to watch something produced by Lincoln Motion Pictures, but unfortunately, like all of their films have been lost. Unsurprising considering that film preservation is already difficult from that time period, but those obviously would not have been high on the list for preservation, which really sucks. And I thought that we were going to end up having to watch something like The Flying Ace, which was considered almost like the Black version of Wings, where it's about African-American pilots in World War I.
Neat.
And it was seen as a very positive portrayal, but it was white produced, but all Black actors, but it was successful. I know it was very inspiring to a lot of people at the time, especially because Bessie Coleman, I think, was partially the inspiration, the first Black female pilot.
Oh, cool.
So there was a lot of positivity that came out of that, and it seemed really cool, but I was happy to find out about Oscar Micheaux, who was an actual successful Black filmmaker who I felt would be a little bit more appropriate to get to do a deep dive into. Just to add onto all of that, I would argue that it's really only been recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, honestly, that Black filmmakers have truly just been able to become a part of American cinema, where the movies are treated like these are successful to general audiences. It feels like a very new thing, even within my lifetime, to not just continue to be segmented and pigeonholed into okay, well, this is a whole subsection that only few people care about, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. Kind of the what you were talking about earlier in terms of in this period limiting the stories that Black actors and Black filmmakers could tell. I think that has been true for a long time, and has persisted to, I'm going to honestly say, even present day still too, right? Because
for sure.
I think we are seeing significantly more Black filmmakers and movies that are not being categorized as just Black movies coming out, but it's still absolutely a thing.
Oh, it's absolutely still there, because you have to look at it as mainstream media and the movies that were successful. This is setting the foundation for what audiences are expected to see and what studios are going to continue to promote. So we look at minstrel characters of this time period, right, where you're a buffoon or you're a maid or you're these sorts of caricatures of people. Those don't fully go away. You could still even trace many of those aspects into oh, this is the sassy black friend, right?
Blind
or this
side.
is, you know,
Blindside. Excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. So you still see that reflected, even if it is perhaps a more quote unquote humanizing portrayal. There are still a ton of movies where minority characters are not treated like they are fully fleshed out characters. And many of the kind of attributes that they have can still be traced back to these very, very early stereotypes. So it is wild how pervasive it is. But I'm glad that we've had at least a surgence of very, very good alternatives to that, right? Some that look at that and then some that are just like phenomenal stories and phenomenal movies that just happen to be either majority black casts or from a black director.
Yeah, like for context, we have not had a black director win Best Director at the Oscars.
Which is absolutely insane because I remember that coming up when Selma came out because Ava DuVernay was very much snubbed in that, and so I remember that conversation.
Who won the year
happening
of Moonlight?
Not Moonlight's director.
not Moonlight's director.
I thought it was for some reason.
And then horror gets snubbed anyway, but Jordan Peele also did not win for Get Out.
Yeah, for like context, we've only had 6 black directors even nominated.
Jeez, that's insane.
It's crazy.
So who was Moonlight's director?
Barry Jenkins.
Okay. Was he nominated at least?
Yeah, he was nominated.
Okay.
Damien Chazelle for La La Land won Best Director.
God. Talk about, I mean, it's a good movie, but talk about mainstream.
Right. Well, that is okay. So looking at Oscar Micheaux, we're going back to a silent movie, which is cool on its own, but also might be a little bit jarring after we've started getting used to old sound movies again. I'm excited just to see. Yeah, definitely. Especially knowing that this movie was very largely seen a direct response to D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. So this movie, you know, tackles issues of racial violence and injustice. And Micheaux, he was a very successful, ultimately, filmmaker. He started out as an author. Apparently, in the first movie he made was kind of a like pseudo autobiographical about his experience as a homesteader. But just to also put into context, like all of this seems so far removed and like so long ago. We learn about history in these very segmented types of ways, but he was born to former slaves. Like this is how close that thread ties everything all together. So born of former slaves, and transitioned into, you know, filmmaking at a time when Black filmmakers were pretty much excluded entirely. So his themes obviously often did address issues of race and class. So I'm excited to get into that and see at least this movie and in that context.
Talk about social mobility on his part. And that's the truly frustrating thing is when so many Black Americans did find success in their respective lanes, you had this backlash and this violence that was unleashed against them. So that even when, you know, they quote unquote play by the rules, as so many retrograde politicians and cultural leaders demand of them, you know, there's still at the end of the day resentment of them to such an extent that can be snuffed out violently. So it's so frustrating to think about, but it'll be neat to see, you know, the fruits of that labor.
Well, are we ready to watch Within Our Gates?
So ready.
Yes, indeed. Hello, everyone. I am back here with Sarah and Abby, and we just completed a viewing of the 1920 film Within Our Gates. Like normal, I'm going to give kind of an overview of the storyline. Hopefully, we'll encourage some of you folks to seek out this film because I did enjoy it. So worthwhile. But let me kind of lay the groundwork here. So Within Our Gates opens on two Black American women, Sylvia and Alma. They're living together. Sylvia is very excited because she has her fiance who's expected to come visit soon. He travels abroad for his work and she's excited to marry him soon. Alma, on the other hand, who I believe is Sylvia's cousin, she kind of has a crush on this fiance character. So she's got it into her head that she's going to sabotage their meetup and create an opportunity for herself to pursue the fiance. Also, in this community is a guy named Larry. Larry is also pining after Sylvia, but Larry's a little bit from the other side of the tracks. He is involved in illicit criminal activity, and we even see him commit a murder over a botched card game early in the movie. But in any case, he really has a strong crush on Sylvia, our main heroine, and is trying to pursue her as well. So the fiance comes into town. But Alma, the roommate of Sylvia, she engineers a scenario where this fiance seems to catch Sylvia talking with another male in an intimate way. So when he's introduced to Sylvia after the fact, her not knowing that he's seen this, he becomes very enraged and actually commits domestic violence toward her. And Alma intercedes at that point, and Sylvia is kind of heartbroken. It appears as though her relationship is maybe irreparably damaged with her fiance, which she was so excited about. So at this point, Sylvia moves out to another area, and she actually joins up with an organization, or a faith-based organization, that is very committed to promoting education for young Black American children in the South. So she's volunteering with them, doing some work with them. And then it turns out they really need an influx of investment, some money to keep their school that they've started going. So Sylvia is asked to travel north to seek out donations to help them keep their operation in place. And so she next moves up north. So Sylvia moves again to another undisclosed northern city. She's struggling for a while to get noticed and to solicit donations from a mostly white population that's relatively well off. When one day she notices a little white boy crossing the street, and it appears he's about to be hit by an early car, one of those very early cars that you'd see in these movies. So she dives into the street, pushes him out of the way, and is clipped by the car herself. Luckily, she survives, and even more luckily, the car just so happens to have been being driven by the driver of a wealthy white woman in the city who comes out, is very distraught that she may have killed this woman, and rushes her to the hospital. Well, when Sylvia comes out of her illness in the hospital, the older, wealthier white woman promises to make it up to her in some way. So Sylvia visits her home, beseeches her to donate to the school in the South that she's been sent up to raise money for. And the well-to-do woman appears excited to do so. Parallel to this, we have a few other characters in the Northern sphere with some things going on. We have another well-to-do woman who is from the South, but is now living in the North. And she is obviously very racist towards Black Americans. We see her reading the newspaper and approvingly nodding about racist rhetoric from a real politician at that time, actually. Sarah was able to look up in real time and notice that, so it keeps the movie very relevant. We also have a Black preacher in the North named Old Ned. And Old Ned's kind of bread and butter is to preach to, the Northern Black population in their community there, and kind of tell them, don't worry about the fact that you're not as educated or as successful as your white brethren. Our natural state is different than theirs. And actually, because you give to our parish and you come to church every day and you live godly lives, you will be rewarded in heaven, whereas all these white materialistic people, they will ultimately end up in hell. So kind of a transgressive look at the way religion was so often used, and Christian religion in particular, I should say, to kind of reinforce existing social hierarchies. So all that to say, it turns out, though, the well-meaning, well-to-do white lady is friends with the Southern white lady, and the Southern white lady comes over to visit her. She attempts to convince the well-to-do white lady not to give money to the school. She says there's no point in that. There's no point in educating, young Black children. It'll just make their heads hurt. They're better doing manual labor. And if you really want to do them some kindness, don't give $5,000 to that school, just to give $100 to Old Ned and his parish. We think she may have swayed the well-meaning older white lady to do that, but when Sylvia comes back to visit her again, turns out she's stuck to her guns. She's not just going to give the black school $5,000, she's actually going to give them $50,000. So it really puts them in a good financial position, and Sylvia's mission in the North is complete, and she heads back south. Just want to mention, there's also a scene with old Ned where he does visit some white gentlemen, and they ask him, "Old Ned, do you think that your race should be allowed to vote? I mean, we like you and everything, but we don't think that's a good idea." And old Ned is like, "Oh, no, of course, gentlemen, that's not our place. That's not our station. We're just focused on being good Christians." And so they have a good laugh at him and kind of kick him around the room. And then we see when he leaves the room, old Ned, his demeanor changes from this accommodating look to this kind of very self-loathing look. And he makes it clear to us, the viewer, that he's not satisfied with the role as kind of a collaborator of white supremacy, you might say. So anyway, circle back to our main character, Sylvia. So Sylvia returns to the South, and at this point, she's been so successful in fundraising for the school that the gentleman who's in charge of the school actually proposes to her to be her husband. However, she is, she's raised her expectations for herself and her life, and she doesn't quite seem ready to settle down yet. Larry, our ne'er-do-well fella who also has a crush on Sylvia, he makes another appearance. He's actually in the midst of a extortion project, and he wants to involve Sylvia in that. And he actually threatens her if she doesn't participate in that process with him. So just when it looks like she's going to be wrapped up in that, a black detective character who has been tracking Larry throughout the film, he finally figures out and connects the dots that he's a criminal and stumbles upon him trying to steal some items and actually shoots and kills Larry. So that actually saves Sylvia from being dragged into that situation. Finally, a gentleman who Sylvia met in the North and really connected with, a Black American male who's an academic and is studying kind of the intersection of Christianity and how it relates to race relations and walking away from it in a very different interpretation from some of the other characters. He comes down south to track down Sylvia, and he's looking for her, and he just misses her, but he stumbles on Alma. And Alma, she's feeling very guilty about the part she played in breaking up Sylvia's prospective marriage. And she opens her heart to this character, Dr. Vivian, the gentleman from the North, and tells him about Sylvia's actual background. So we get a flashback to Sylvia's history. And it turns out that she was raised by another family, not biologically her family, but a family called the Landrys, who were tenant farmers in the South, were led to believe, not too distantly related from slaves, and they're working on the lands of a former slave-owning family, the Griddlestones. But Sylvia is very intelligent. She's educating herself. She's learned some counting and math skills and reading and writing, and she's helping, through her education, the Landry family that's taken such good care of her, mother and father Landry and their young son who looks up to Sylvia. She's helping them budget, and she's helped them to realize that their landlord, Mr. Griddlestone, has been taking advantage of them financially and overcharging them for things as tenant farmers. So armed with this knowledge, Father Landry goes to Mr. Griddlestone, very politely says, we don't want to be taken advantage of here. We've run the numbers, and this is what we owe. Mr. Griddlestone has no sympathy. He is obviously a racist. He points out that his father taught him the only way to handle the Landry's people, that is to say Black Americans, is with the whip or with the hand. And so they get into an altercation. And Griddlestone is especially angry because he's been forewarned that the Landry's daughter, Sylvia, has been educated by another sort of collaborationist character, his servant, who's we're led to believe is a big gossip and kind of will spread rumors around if he thinks it'll benefit him. He's a Black man as well, but he lives in the house with the Griddlestones as their servant. So there's an altercation during which a poor white Southerner outside the window hears Mr. Griddlestone compare Landry to poor whites in the South in a way that is unflattering, who then takes his rifle and takes a shot at Mr. Griddlestone and actually shoots and kills him. So that leaves Mr. Landry in a compromising position because Mr. Griddlestone's gun is in his hand. It looks as though he has killed his landlord, this very prominent white gentleman. And so he has to think quickly and get his family out of their home and into the swamps in the South. And as all of this is happening, that servant character, Mr. Griddlestone's servant, he's spreading word around the local town that Mr. Griddlestone was murdered by Mr. Landry in a bloody rage. And so the white population of the local town is whipped up into a racist frenzy. And their men and even women arm themselves and are marching out into the swamps to find the Landry family and Sylvia, who are now on the run, implicated in this murder of this prominent gentleman. Very unfortunately and tragically, the white mob, while they're looking for the family, they become bored because they're having such little success at first, and they actually end up lynching the servant, the black servant character who ratted out the Landry family. So he gets his comeuppance in a way, but in a way that's very disturbing. Eventually, the mob does find the Landry family in a very brutal scene, kills both Mr. and Mrs. Landry, while thankfully their son does escape. Sylvia is off hiding, scrounging for food in a house, and she's stumbled upon by Mr. Griddlestone's younger brother, who seizes on her. It looks as if he's about to actually rape her, and it's a very frightful scene. But he stops just short of it when he notices she has a marking on her chest, and it's actually a tattoo, a specific tattoo that she was branded with as a child to indicate that she was actually the result of a rape between himself as a white landowner and a slave. So we find out that Sylvia is actually the daughter of the brother of Mr. Griddlestone and an unnamed slave woman. So when he realizes this, he obviously stops the sexual assault, and her life is spared. And Alma recounts all this to Dr. Vivian, and it really, the weight of Sylvia's life experience comes over him. And shortly after, we find he finally does reconnect with Sylvia. We're back in the modern day, and he gives her kind of an encouraging speech. He recounts, it would be easy to leave the United States and go to Cuba or Brazil or another country or even Europe to escape all this terror that they live under. But he says, I love my country. I know you love your country. We're going to continue to do work here to better our racist position, and ultimately convinces Sylvia to marry him and to stay in the U.S. and pursue their lives together. So kind of ending on a high note, but after a heck of a lot of tragedy up to that point.
It just continues to impress me, your ability to summarize
I don't know
what we just watched. I think out of all of the movies we've watched so far, I think this one has affected me more than most. Like, it felt the most real. And even though it's, I think, the oldest or tied with the oldest, I think Cabinet of Dr. Caligari might have been the same year. But it genuinely felt like for the first time, we're getting a glimpse at what that time period was actually like for minorities, but especially for Black Americans. So this definitely resonated. It may resonate more with modern audiences just because it's actually reflecting things more accurately that we know were going on. So even though it was really infuriating, this is refreshing that it's being reflected, and infuriating that this was being reflected at this time, and we still don't get to see this in mainstream movies for so long. But it does feel like a very important film, and it is the oldest surviving film from an African-American director, and I'm glad that it made it. But just, definitely left me with like more emotional responses than other movies that we've seen for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious. So like, I missed when y'all were in the silent film era for like the main episode run that first year. I was curious what this was going to look like, because I know that it was made on a shoestring budget, essentially. Apparently they didn't have any opportunity to like reshoot anything. Costumes were all borrowed. That's pretty typical for like, I think you see it later in the like Herb Jeffries Western movies that are like the first Black American Westerns. They're all like B or C movies. And you see that too with like the blaxploitation movies of the 60s and 70s, right? Where it's like kind of making stuff on a shoestring budget. So I'm very curious, like, what are your thoughts on how this compares to some of the other silent movies that you watch from the same period? Where, I mean, I know that y'all were watching movies that were essentially made for gajillions of dollars in the like Hollywood studio system.
Yeah. This felt more modern even in a lot of ways than like Wings, Seventh Heaven. They did have very large like war sequences, so you can see the budget in those cases. The Racket was a little bit more like this one where the setting was just focused on the characters. And comparing this to The Racket, this felt more advanced with some of the film techniques that Oscar was like choosing to do. And kind of like Jake mentioned, a lot of it is narrative choices, but they are reflected in the film. So I think it could come from his background as the way that he thinks as a writer. Right. But two things that kind of stood out was that he used like double exposure for daydreaming, for flashbacks. And then later in that nonlinear storytelling, we get her past explained towards the end of the movie, right? In a prolonged flashback sequence. So it just felt, like I said, just a lot more advanced than like The Racket or even Wings. Everything else that we've watched has been pretty linear and pretty straightforward at that time. And it was even years later, that was 1927.
Absolutely. And when you think about how quickly cinematic technology was changing throughout that period, 7 years might as well be 20 years. But yeah, I agree, Sarah. I was really struck by the way, maybe in part because it was maybe a more shoestring budget, he had to rely on different techniques cinematically, like you mentioned, and also narratively, like you mentioned. I mean, I can't recall really seeing many, if any, flashbacks in most of the movies that we've seen so far. And this time it was used in a really effective way because he makes an interesting decision to front load Sylvia's current life experience and then later reveal all of the tragic circumstances that led up to it. And it makes the whole thing more powerful in a way. I think if it started out from her in the conditions that were later told that she started out in, if the movie started in those conditions, it would be more linear and it would kind of be anticlimactic in a way. Whereas here we appreciate her life journey so much more knowing where she came from. So I thought that was such a good decision. And just the way the director, he showed a whole spectrum of different Black experiences at that time, which I thought was really cool. It wasn't just Black people as victims or Black people as criminals in white produced movies or whatever other stereotypes, the minstrel character, although we do see the betraying house servant is kind of portrayed that way. Interesting that he's portrayed that way. But more importantly, we see all these different Black characters living these vibrant lives in these communities, dealing with their own problems as human beings. And it's very humanizing in a medium which up to this point has been nothing but non-humanizing for this demographic.
I think kind of going back to that, it's interesting that the structure of the script is, like you were saying, we don't get Sylvia's like the horrific things that happen to her until a flashback late in the movie. And it feels like the structure of that script and how we're moving through time and different characters' perceptions of people is it kind of gives you the opportunity to see her as a person rather than just a victim of the circumstances that happened to her and her family in the South. The thing that really, really fascinates me about this movie is, so when you get to the portion with Sylvia's family and the like landowner that they rent from or that they do business with, is a very cool, I don't want to call it like Rashomon effect. So Rashomon is the Akira Kurosawa movie that comes out in, I believe it's 1950, where you get multiple perspectives on a crime. It's not quite that, because that is, you're presented with all, I think it's 4, as if they're all true and you're never told what is true. But you do get something kind of similar here where you get an instance of what the white landowner assumes is happening, the conversation, which is like, he assumes that his renters, that they are saying, oh, we're just as good as like the white men. My adopted daughter is as educated as a white woman. So now you're not going to cheat me anymore. When in reality, it's literally like there's a card, like here's what he thinks is happening. But what is actually the actual conversation is happening is like level-headed, fair conversation about, hey, you need to keep your books, Dad.
Yeah.
And then kind of like using that as showing how white Americans are using assumptions and the perception of reality to victimize themselves as a way to excuse the fact that they are going to continue to oppress. And it's kind of similar thing of where we see a ton of, you know, if we're talking about I'm now blanking on the name of the movie.
Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, Birth of a Nation. Like that Birth of a Nation, the entire movie is about like the assault of a white woman by an African-American man. And it's like that, the reality of that was so much less than that what we see here is like Sylvia getting assaulted by a rich white guy.
Turns out to be her father.
Yeah. Thanks, Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
But like, I think it's very interesting how that this movie is utilizing like perspective and like, this is what people think are happening, but this is the reality of the situation, and kind of using its own narrative arc in terms of like, we see Sylvia first as a person before we actually get her backstory to kind of do the same thing. So you're kind of allowed to assume things or like figure out who she is as a person before you get that information as well.
All of that was just so well done. And what we also see throughout that whole sequence is the way that it later gets reported, right? Is that it gets reported as like, oh, he attacked him and like poor. Yeah, exactly. So just seeing how those things either unintentionally or intentionally get warped. And yeah, you see it in different facets of the movie, just in what people are assuming is true, what assumptions are being made, and how people justify their actions based on that. The character of Geraldine that Jake mentioned, that racist woman who's trying to advocate for the like right to vote being taken away. So she has this whole long spiel when she's talking to Evelyn about essentially justifying oppression, right? So one, this movie came out the year that women got the right to vote. So that's just an interesting, little tie-in there. Yeah. But it specifies that she's literally against women's suffrage because she doesn't want Black women to get the vote. So she's willing to spite herself and ruin her own kind of like self-interest just to continue that sort of power structure, which all of these things, we know that there were people who thought this way, and it's just crazy to me. And one thing that I was also really glad to see is, you mentioned this scene in your summary, Jake, but the preacher who is very much playing up to we should all know our place, etc. And the people he's preaching to are unfortunately accepting his guidance because he's trusted as a leader. But we see that he is very self-aware and he's doing this just for himself to have some slice of a very small pie that he's allowed to have. And I think all of these recognitions and statements that Oscar Micheaux is making, in that like these people exist on a surface level, we would see that preacher character and just be like, wow, essentially viewing him the same as we see Griddlestone's servant, right? As just being misguided or whatever else, and it being this really tragic sort of thing. But it's like, no, it's a tragedy in the other direction where he knows very well what he's doing, and he's still choosing to do it because that's what benefits him, even if it's, disgusting to him. So just very powerful choices, I thought.
Well, these are questions that Black Americans and oppressed groups of all kinds, I think of women as well, have to make about, how do you carve out a livable existence for yourself in a wider socioeconomic and political environment that is at times very actively hostile to you. And so that's a very personal decision. And I think in a way, it makes the old Ned character more humanized because I don't know, again, I'm a white American, so I can't imagine, where I faced with some of those choices, especially in that time period, how I would react to it just in order to survive. But what Oscar does so effectively in this film is he shows that full spectrum of the Black experience at that time. So you come away with it not agreeing with all the decisions all the characters obviously make, but you come away with it understanding, I think, why people go down that route, whether it's Larry pursuing a criminal lifestyle or the servant just supplementing himself to his white master and the white citizens to his own detriment in the end, or Sylvia and her ultimate husband who are educating themselves, who are trying to make the world better against all odds, but that's tough too. So, it leaves me saying, just it's very cliche to say, but until you walk a mile in somebody's moccasins, it's very difficult to pass judgment. And this was a great portrayal of the different reactions to what was an evil system, which is still in place to some extent.
And we're going to continue seeing this as, unfortunately, in like Best Picture nominees and winners, as we've already seen and as we've already talked about, that Black characters are going to be the mammy type or the buffoon or whatever else. Like,
throw Cimarron in the trash.
Or Cimarron, absolute trash. But as we've discussed, and as we have to acknowledge that in real life, those actors, right, were having to make the decision.
Right.
If they want to be artists, if they want to be in film, in, successful mainstream careers within that, then these are the roles that are available to them. Even though, as we've already talked about, even in this episode, it's so frustrating because there's so much rich storytelling that is being done or wants to be done that isn't given a spotlight or the funds or whatever else to be successful. But we are going to just, see it. We're going to encounter a lot of Black actors and Black creators who get typecast, and we're going to see them recur. And there will be at least a sense of like, oh, nice, Hattie McDaniels winning for Best Supporting Actress. That's huge, but also for the role in Gone with the Wind, like it's just hard to.
It's funny you mentioned that, not to get a little ahead of ourselves, because we will eventually get to that episode, but she caught a lot of flack. My understanding of the situation is after winning, she erred more on the side of protecting her career than involving herself in the burgeoning civil rights movement, which, again, impossible to pass judgment, in my opinion, on somebody.
I agree.
In that situation, especially as a non-Black person, but a really great microcosm in her life and her experience of exactly what you're talking about.
I just think of, like, we talked about this last time I recorded about the Mae West movie where she has the maid servant character, and talking about how that character sucks, but it's a product of Mae West advocating to have a Black woman on screen with her. But then it's so frustrating to be like, and that's what we got when we could have had literally any of this stuff, kind of thing. Right. Like something more genuine. It's not like we didn't know how to make movies about genuine Black experiences. It's that they didn't care to.
Yeah. Yeah, I am. So Oscar Micheaux, he made 40 movies total, and some of the actors that we saw in this would be in those as well. Like Evelyn Prier, I think, was in the first one. She was the main character. In this, she played Sylvia. And Jake, you mentioned that she passed away early, but I did kind of just take a glance at what she was in, and she was considered in the Black community, she was known as the first lady of the screen, right? Because she's
pretty great in this.
First star. Yeah. She was great. From what I'm reading, I think she starred in 19 movies during this time, mostly silent films, but they were very versatile. Like sometimes she would be a villain, sometimes a heroine, sometimes she had a ton of different facets. And I guess she spoke pretty openly. She only wanted to kind of take either challenging roles or roles that didn't demean African Americans, which I think was absolutely fantastic. And I'm just so sad that she passed away so young, because I'm curious what that would have turned into. I think her final film performance was actually in the movie Blonde Venus, which has Cary Grant and Marlene Dietrich. So was at least a major movie in that. I don't know what her role was, but obviously not the main character in that. But again, it is just unfortunate to have lost her young.
We know she was conscious of that, so I would assume, it's not going to be the most degrading role, but again, we'll have to check out
even
the movie.
If it, we'd have to see, or even if it's like a role that would normally be degrading, maybe just having more nuance or a background of the why, like why is this character this way? What you bring to the narrative to that matters.
I was really impressed with this movie, guys, and I'll lay my cards out on the table. I adjusted my expectations, knowing that it was going to be such an uphill battle for Oscar and for these filmmakers to make a successful film, given the way the deck was stacked against them. And it just blew my expectations out of the water. I mean, for a silent film, I'll admit it seemed at points that maybe I think there was a cue card that seemed to indicate maybe some footage was lost. And at one or two times, the story gets a little complex and interweaving. But overall, I thought it was a really strong film. And like I say, it really exceeded my expectations.
Yeah, me too. I was pretty invested in all of it. And I'm just glad that, like I said, it survived it all. And I think it was actually a Spanish copy. Like they found one copy in Spain years
lucky.
later. Yeah, and they basically, the inner titles that we see are translated back into English from Spanish.
That makes
because
sense.
it was just the one. Yeah.
Wow. Gosh, it makes you wonder, because I looked at those statistics too of how much has been lost to time, how much of that lived experience.
So many movies.
That's our collective history, but in particular Black history. Hashtag Black History Month. Please cut that. It just felt really right.
Do we have other thoughts that we wanted to share about the movie?
All the performances are really great.
Genuinely.
And I think it's interesting that, I guess, the director's aesthetics were something that were criticized in the period, of saying that they weren't particularly like artistic. And I think that's really interesting.
It's weird to me.
Because it does feel, just the staging of it is so natural, which I think comes back to a money thing, right? Versus, I think it's kind of the aesthetic of filmmaking at this period was very theatrical versus not like shooting in actual rooms and on location and outside on the street and that kind of thing quite as much.
Right.
So kind of interesting to see how something that got criticized in the 20s is now feels very modern to our eyeballs.
Yeah. That is so true. There was one scene where like the detective is asking Larry, like, oh, where's Red? And we see a close up of Larry's reaction, and he kind of like coughs while he's smoking the cigarette. There are just like a lot of choices because of those close shots, like very expressive acting. That, like you're saying, it feels very modern, but it is very funny to think that at the time, because what was being awarded or lauded was like making it look as sophisticated and refined and theatrical, like stage plays theatrical as much as possible. It's like, oh, that's kind of funny, because now that seems very dated to us.
Right. It's such a good point. Whereas in this time period, a lot of folks were going to the theater to escape the mundane aspects of life. I'm always very impressed in a modern sense to see real life reflected back in film. And I think I'm always fascinated by, like I referenced before, the different strategies that people that live under oppression employ to survive and to thrive. And I thought the portrayal of, you have almost two sides of the same coin in Ned, the preacher, and the house servant, who are employing the same strategy, but one of them, it's almost like it feels like it's a generation later. Like we're still in Jim Crow, but you're more respectable person. You're invited into the room with the whites and they're hobnobbing with you.
I think too, like the difference between North and South, right? Like our preacher is a Northern preacher and the servant is in the South. So it's like a completely different, I mean, not completely different, but it is a different like social atmosphere.
Yeah, different social atmosphere and different opportunities afforded to them, where, the servant in the South, because of that, like basically just forced ignorance, right? Yeah. So even though they're employing the same strategy, one of them genuinely believes it out of a sense of naivety, right? And the other one knows better.
Yeah. I mean, they're still putting themselves in that position to a certain extent in terms of like, they think that that's their only option, but.
Right, the safe way to side, or like the right.
Interesting too, the optimistic tone that the movie ultimately takes. I thought it was because not only does Dr. Vivian, the husband, his whole thing is he's looking at Christian scripture and finding texts to validate that all people are created equal, regardless of their race, and that's a neat, diametrically opposed way to how old Ned and other white characters are using scripture to keep Black people down. So an interesting take on religion, but also an interesting take on the future of the Black experience. So this is right in the middle of those two major riots and massacres. So people, it was up for debate, I think, the best strategy to move forward. And Oscar seems to be pretty optimistic.
Interesting, too, that like the two characters who are in that romance, right, one is from the North and one is from the South. So it's essentially a unification of like both Southern Black interests and Northern Black interests in a way that I feel like so much of history, particularly in terms of what we're taught in school, right, is talking about like, oh, well, the North and the South were two very different things, blah, 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 of like as if they were completely different when it's like in reality, no, like these experiences kind of like cross that North-South border. And also to like the experiences of Black Americans in the North and the South were not so fundamentally different that they couldn't essentially like literally in this case join hands over it, right?
Right. Important to note, the Ku Klux Klan in the second generation of it was just as, well, not just as prominent, but very prominent in the North.
Right. And then you mentioned, so, okay, the Cuba thing, because I was a little confused and I went back, and what he says is like, because he's urging Sylvia to be proud of the country, you know? And he says something like, look at what we did in Cuba. That's why Cuba comes. But like, what happened? I'm ignorant to history. So like, what happened? Because I know it's a very different now.
Is, that might have been a little bit of rose-colored glasses, because around that time period, we overthrew the Spanish rule over Cuba and basically installed we facilitated the creation of their own government, but very quickly it became, essentially a client state of the United States instead of the Spanish Empire.
Yeah.
So, he's taking a little bit, he's very pro-American, but, it was imperialism essentially, but taking a positive look on it.
So he was probably like, oh, we freed them from the Spanish, but the reality of that is like, oh, dude, but we just replaced them.
But if you were a liberal-minded person reading the newspaper at that time, you'd be saying, look at these great things we've done. So I think that's also a reflection of he's an educated, new member of the American intelligentsia. Look, we can be a part of this imperialist project too, to take a cynical look at it. But I don't think that everyone had the full details of what was going on with that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Okay.
A good question, because I didn't totally understand what he was saying there. So thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, I'm glad you also have that knowledge, because I was like, maybe Jake will know, because I have no idea. History is
If it's not useful to your day to day, there's a chance I know about it.
Excellent.
What else was I gonna say? So I knew there was gonna be a lynching, but man, I was viscerally disturbed when that unfolded, because you're introduced to the Landry family, and it's such a wholesome environment of Sylvia using her education to better the lives of these people that have been so generous to her, and him just walking into Mr. Griddlestone's house just with this smile on his face and this expectation that if he deals straightforward and honestly with him, he's going to be treated fairly. And to see that wiped away in an instant, and then to see the awful, awful ramifications of that a little bit later, man, that was heartbreaking. You feel like you've seen so many movies that portray Black suffering, but it never gets old is the wrong phrase. It never stops. Audience will understand what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Continues to be effective.
Yeah. And kind of on that note, as you can imagine, that the movie was very censored.
What? This
especially
movie?
Depending where it was, this movie and this one. So yeah, the lynching scenes and the attempted rape and stuff, those were all cut, especially after, like you talked about, right, the 1919 upheaval and unrest that was going on there. They were like, no, this is gonna reignite many of those things. So most theaters cut it. I think in Chicago, they showed the full movie in most theaters, but it was pretty hit or miss. And obviously some places just refused to screen it at all for, I'm sure, part of it just being that it's an all Black cast,
Right. I wanted to circle back to that excellent point that Abby made about how insidiously and repeatedly throughout history, the white population of America manages to victimize itself and utilize that sense of constant threat in order to further justify, the perpetuation of their social dominance and these systems that we still live under to some extent.
Well, Jake, I don't think you understand. Eggs are very expensive.
Yeah. They're hard to afford.
Yeah, it's real tough out there to buy an egg.
Oh man, that just cuts through it, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, that's the thing. It's like, if you were, give me an honest oppressor over a histrionic, warped person living in La La Land, but still holds all the power over everybody else, at least I can deal with that person. I understand where they're coming from. I know what their priorities are. And, we can go to battle politically, militarily, physically, whatever it is. But these folks that just bend the truth and bend reality to fit these really warped, views on reality that's so different from the obvious, it's endlessly frustrating. It's a big part of why I don't believe in democracy anymore. But that's a story for another podcast. I don't know what you do with that.
Yeah.
No, yeah, because it's like you're not arguing from the same reality.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just like, what do you even do? Yeah, it's yeah.
And it's unique. It's ingrained in our national DNA, and it will not go away. And I really don't know how you fix it at this point.
Yeah, I think it's been there a long time, right? So,
like, obviously, it's
motions to this movie from the 1920s.
Yeah, we're not on video, but I did motion to my screen. No one could see it.
I'm telling you, if you haven't seen American Fiction yet, that's a great follow-up to this one.
It's also just like a great examination of American literature publishing. It's so funny.
Right.
Wonderful work. But we'll get to talk about this later, because that's an Oscar nom.
We will.
So.
Oh, I forgot.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, when we're all like in our 40s.
When we're in our 40s. Maybe even older than that, honestly.
No.
If America is still around.
Yeah, that's the main thing.
This podcast is going to outlive America.
No, but that's true.
But that part, exactly. I was like, no, we're going to stay on track timeline wise, so long as we're not all dead. All right. So,
okay.
Oh, Lord. Okay. Well, I think obviously listeners already know where we stand on this, but do you guys think this one was worth watching for our listeners?
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually so glad that we saw this before we watched Gone with the Wind, which I know is not for a while, but I think it's going to be very valuable to have this in our pocket when we talk about that movie. It's also easy to find because it's on like Wikipedia, it's on YouTube in full.
Archive.org.
Kino Lorber just re-released it. So it's definitely like a movie that is easily acquired if you want to watch it.
Absolutely. Highly recommend it to everyone. And with the versions, like Abby's saying, it is easy to find, but the scores or lack of scores will vary. So that's just kind of a heads up to find one that feels a little bit better for you, or watch it fully in silence. I don't know. I don't think it would have been too bad, honestly, silently either.
I feel like if it were me, I don't think I could do like a full hour of like listening to this, like my thoughts in my head versus focusing on the movie. But,
I think what I would, kind of same. I think I would watch it with the score up until the flashback sequence. And then I might either watch that silently or with a different score. Because having the same sort of like more upbeat classical music for a lot of that
was rough.
Didn't quite
I suspect
fit.
that the one that we watched had music just kind of like thrown on top of it.
Right.
That's what happened
definitely.
with
So there
Wings.
might be a better score. Yeah, except Wings was worse because it was just the same song on repeat the entire time, but very similar. Yeah, there was no differentiation in that soundtrack.
Yeah, maybe then find the Kino Lorber one because I know they just like rescored it.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested, honestly, to
go buy this DVD.
To see what that one is like. Yeah.
I would say if you want to get an idea of great silent movies, watch Wings, watch Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and watch this one, Within Our Gates. And what a great window into the 1920s if you do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. So glad that we were able to do this for February. And be sure to join us in March for the next episode of our regular series for Best Picture nominees and winners, and for our bonus episode, which March will be looking at Women's History Month. So that should actually provide some good insight into another perspective at that time too. So I'm looking forward to that.
Bye.
Bye. Oh yeah.
And that's it.
Like, follow, and subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, I love you. Bye-bye.
Okay, I love you. Bye.